Alright, what's up guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com, and I gotta break it to you guys. So normally, and also kind of show something, right? I don't always enjoy the books that I do the reviews for or that I read, right? And this next one is going to be one of them. And so basically I kind of thought to myself, I want to become more or less of an expert, or at least more educated, we'll say, like with the topic of the Federal Reserve, its history, and I kind of just became obsessed with it, right? And just wanted to learn as much as possible. So I basically, quite literally, went on Amazon, was like books about the Federal Reserve, and just basically bought the whole front page that was relevant, right? It's a search engine, so not all of it's relevant. But with that being said, I found this one, The Tyranny of the Federal Reserve, right? And I was like, it's got a cool, one of the old political graphics or cartoons you used to see all the time in like history class, things like that. Normally you see it with like Boss Tweed or that sort of thing, right? And so I was looking at that, I was like, this could be very interesting. And I started reading it, and honestly, it took me a bit longer than I wished it would have, mostly because it was somewhat difficult to read. Not because it was of the language or how it was written per se, or I guess kind of is how it was written, but it's just, I got irritated at some points. Not just because some of it seemed very superficial. However, for me, it's the sourcing is a big problem. So I'm going to kind of go more in depth on say some positive things about it first. So basically, for a beginner's book, someone who doesn't know a lot about the Federal Reserve, or maybe kind of the non-mainstream argument for it, it's a great book in that respect. It gets it across very well. However, to contrast to that, the author does it in a very, I think, hyperbolic way, and yeah. And there's very, very, very little referencing whatsoever. It's very highly opinionated, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? You just have to keep that in mind when you read it. And so it's just, there's some historical context to it, and he does give some citations. I don't know if it's just because of my background in, say, like the sciences and what I'm used to in terms of citing, to giving actual like academic citations, that sort of thing. And that's something you typically see with these types of books. This is the first one that hasn't had like any formal citation whatsoever. But he does give reference to some of the books that he used. And I think even in kind of the on the back of the book in this case, where they give somewhat of a summary, things like that, he says, let's see if I can get the exact phrasing. So, drawing heavily from the writings and ideas of Ben Franklin, Alfred Crozier, and Carroll Quigley. I wanted to say it because drawing heavily from the writings, and you can tell he sincerely did that, which again, nothing wrong with that. That's pretty much all, I mean, academic work is in general, if you think about it. At least that's my opinion. I mean, it's all kind of derived from something, right? And so you have to keep that in mind. But again, it's very, very hyperbolic in some respects. And so, and also some of the more technical language or concepts you'd see in, say, a study of the monetary system, doesn't go in depth, really. It's kind of a very superficial argument in that respect. And I think from a historical perspective, I thoroughly enjoyed and think it is a very big positive, that of the historical depth he went to. But in terms of the actual, like, technical, how to word it, the technical kind of know-how on how the system works explicitly was lacking. Which, again, thinking it of the context of the book itself after reading the entire thing, I mean, it's not necessarily bad, right? It's just that's not what you should, if you're looking for the more technical aspect of things, it's not in this book, right? However, if you want more of the historical kind of concept things and maybe other rabbit holes, I think it's a great way to get leads, right? That's how I basically used it too. So like I hadn't heard of Alfred Owen Crozier before this book, really. And so like I didn't know he had other books. It's actually where this political cartoon is from. It actually says Crozier on the bottom, if you guys can actually see that far. But anyways, so I actually got Crozier's book that he wrote about the Federal Reserve to get that point of view as well. And that's also like to put in contrast to the book on Paul Warburg, or written by Paul Warburg, that I've been going through steadily with the videos and so on, right? Kind of getting that respect. But as an example of kind of the hyperbolicness in a way of the book, so he goes at some point he's talking about, seems like Harry Truman, the KKK. Harry Truman is burning in hell alongside Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and Hitler. That's an explicit quote. Just kind of showing, again, putting it in context. And so one of my big problems with things like this and doing reviews is people tend to place value judgment on things that don't really need a value judgment. It just kind of puts it in context with the book itself, right? So you have to think about what was the purpose of this book, right? And that's what it was. And I also say that because I actually, about halfway through, I was like, hey, who is this guy? Because he doesn't have any credentials that I could find or that are written on the book. And so, who the hell is he, right? And so I looked him up and found very, very little information. Maybe I just didn't look hard enough or just didn't happen to find it, knowing how kind of Google works in that respect. It just didn't want me to find it, I don't know. Search engines have that trick in a way. But just things like that to keep in mind. And so I really want to emphasize the need both to read the book, because I do recommend you read it, right? Because it gives that alternate perspective. And that's one of the biggest things I thoroughly enjoyed of the book itself, is it was more of, you get kind of, I guess the best way I can think of to describe it is the Creature of Jekyll Island on steroids, with a lot less actual like citation, right? And that's one of the reasons why I loved reading the Creature of Jekyll Island, is because he uses so many citations. How did I forget his name already? G. Edward Griffin, the author of the Creature of Jekyll Island. And so that is probably, honestly, if you haven't read it and you want to learn more about the Federal Reserve, that's probably the go-to one to read, because of the citations especially. And again, he's kind of branded as a conspiracy theorist for some reason, which I never really understood, because when I actually started like cross-referencing his work with kind of the more what you'd see on mainstream media or mainstream general thought, I guess you could say, and it's pretty close. Like a lot of the stuff that he talks about in his book is actually explicitly written on the Federal Reserve's website itself. Sometimes even the Board of Governors website. The whole story of the kind of the Aldrich group getting together in Jekyll Island and the duck hunting and that sort of thing, right? That whole storyline is on the Federal Reserve website. I wrote about that in a post quite some time ago. That sort of thing. But again, The Tyranny of the Federal Reserve, it's written by Brian O'Brien, I don't know. Kind of for the not so great lighting. So that's the cover. Again, have mixed feelings. We'll definitely need to read it again. There are some points in the book to where I'm like, I don't even know what he's arguing for. Maybe it's just because, again, this was more of a, I don't want to say casual read, because it wasn't really that. Because as you can see, I always highlight a bunch. And so I did notice I wasn't highlighting as much in this book, which is fair. But yeah, but definitely a more, I guess, controversial view. And so mostly on how he explains things, specifically with like the use of basically banking in general, and classifying earning interest on any form of debt as usury in a way, and that basically it should be illegal. And he has his own like alternate system he comes up with, like a monetary council, basically controlled by Congress more or less, contrary to the Federal Reserve in a way, and basically goes through my thing. And this is kind of I guess a teaser, because I really need to look more into it, but a lot of the arguments he gives for his alternate system remind me a lot of socialism, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a proponent of socialism, obviously. It's just that's what came to mind, and I need to look into it further. And also, MMT started ringing alarm bells in my head as I was going through it, talking about how, especially when he explains how we should no longer have Federal Reserve notes, they should be U.S. government, essentially, banknotes, or not banknotes, but notes, right? And that basically, instead of like charging interest and that stuff, the government would just print it instead of borrowing, right? Because how the borrowing affects the country and that sort of thing, right? Not to go down that rabbit hole, read the book to kind of get more in depth on that, right? But basically, instead of falling prey to usury, as he puts it, by the government borrowing, they should just print the money to pay for everything. And he said it'll be cheaper, right? Which sounds a lot like MMT in a way. But yeah. But again, I'm going to wrap that up, leave it be. Definitely, Carol Quigley is a author that I've seen brought up multiple times, so I'll look more into them. And so on, yeah. Definitely interesting. And I'm going to leave it there. I don't have much else to say about that without going verbatim through the book. So, anyways, I'm going to leave that here. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.